Hello, my friends of the Psychedelic Renaissance. It's Tom Hatzis, your psychedelic historian, and this is Medieval Christians, Plant Medicines, and Psychedelia. Before we get started, if you're into this kind of content, please subscribe to my Psychedelic Historian YouTube page, and make sure you hit that little bell icon so that you're notified every time I post a new video. Also, it'd be swell to see you on Instagram. Please find me at Psychedelic Historian. And we do have a private Sanctum Psychedelia Facebook group where we talk about all things wild and weird. So it'd be great to have you join that conversation. Please link up with us there as well. With that out of the way, let's get into it. There's just something I wanted to clarify right from the start. As I learned when I released my last video, Ancient Psychedelic History and the Vice Narrative, some people objected to my use of the word psychedelic to describe things like cannabis, opium, and solanaceous plants like mandrake. And in a way, they're not wrong. The word psychedelic did not exist in the ancient and medieval worlds. However, there was a certain kind of experience that does reek of a psychedelic experience when you read the sources. So, when I use the word psychedelic, I'm not talking about a specific plant or fungus. I'm talking about a specific kind of experience, an otherworldly experience, a mystical experience. Those otherworldly mystical experiences can be obtained through modern creations like LSD and mescaline. However, when you read ancient and medieval sources pertaining to witches, magicians, and alchemists, it seems like those people were having very similar experiences while using things like cannabis, opium, and solanaceous plants like henbane, mandrake, and belladonna. That is the olive branch that I am more than happy to extend to my critics, and I hope that in good faith, they'll meet me halfway. Now, with my previous video now fully clarified, let's get into the plant-based meat of this video. One common myth popular today about psychedelics or plant medicines and religion is this idea that when Christians came to power, they suppressed, covered up, or otherwise stopped common people from having these kinds of experiences. We're going to look at the evidence and determine if medieval Christians did use mind-manifesting plants to have otherworldly experiences, and decide whether or not that information was suppressed or otherwise covered up. I'm not totally sure where our modern idea of Christians having this blanket suppression over plant medicines comes from, but my best guess is that it stems from the Mexican Inquisition, which lasted from 1571 to 1820. During those centuries, there were absolutely conquistadors and missionaries actively banning these plants and mushrooms and cacti and persecuting and prosecuting people for using them. For our purposes, let's zero in on 1620, when the unenlightened assholes who oversaw the Mexican Inquisition penned the first law against entheogenic practices in the Americas. Inasmuch as the use of the herb or root called peyote has been introduced into these provinces for the purpose of detecting thefts, of divining other happenings, and of foretelling future events, it is an act of superstition condemned as opposed to the purity and integrity of our holy Catholic faith. This is certain, because neither the said herb or any other can possess the virtue or inherent quality of producing the effects claimed, nor can any cause the mental images, fantasies, and hallucinations on which the above stated divinations are based. In these latter are plainly perceived the suggestion and intervention of the devil. And so the various kinds of psychedelic practices of Central America went underground, presumably for centuries. This same kind of active condemnation of psychedelic practices in Central America does pop up again in the 1950s, courtesy of two Bible translators, Eunice Pike and Florence Hansen, both of whom tried to stop the Mazatec people of Oaxaca, Mexico from consuming psilocybin mushrooms, the endeavors of which they wrote about in their article, Mushroom Ritual versus Christianity. So there's definitely a history of conquistadors and 20th century missionaries actively trying to stop the various peoples of Central America from having these kinds of psychedelic experiences. But what about medieval times? Were Christian authorities just as zealous about keeping these kinds of experiences away from the flock? Believe it or not, plenty of evidence shows that Christians readily embraced these kinds of plants for their medicinal qualities, their recreational qualities, and their visionary qualities. Let's begin with the medicinal properties of mandrake, which some Christians used to quell what they believed to be immoral desires of the flesh. Looking at the writing of the first great Christian apologist, Origen, will give us a feel for this kind of practice. And even as those who have drunk of the mandrake no longer feel the movements of their body, so should those who seek to cultivate virtue empty the cup and thus lull their passions. What Origen is saying here is quite telling. For those Christians who wanted to go out and rage and drink and fornicate and party, Origen is saying, no. Stay home, drink some mandrake wine, and calm those carnal desires. Mandrake wine will knock a person into this very trance-like and somewhat mellow state, and Origen is saying, yeah, he prefers that to people going out and raging. So this is a really interesting situation. Origen is not suppressing plant medicines like mandrake. He's saying, use mandrake to suppress some of your baser instincts. But mandrake wasn't the only plant medicine that ancient Christians had available to them. One Syrian bishop living around the middle of the 5th century, named Theodoret, had a penchant for opium. In fact, he even tells us what he likes about it. An opiate brings deadness to the world and sin, and tranquil sleep, free from all disturbances attained by quaffing the chalice of holy doctrine. To me, it sounds like Theodoret liked to take opium to sort of drown out the chaos and the noise of the world so that he could engage in Bible study. Now, this is not to say that all church leaders approved of these kinds of practices. However, in some cases, their very disapproval tells us just how widespread these practices were. One example would be Ambrose, now known as Saint Ambrose, who admonished his colleagues. Why need I speak of opium, which has come to be used almost daily? In Ambrose's opinion, the only drug practice any Christian need engage themselves in was bumping lines of Jesus. There was also Boethius, one of many former pagans turned Christian, who complained, Haec venena potentius, detrahunt hominem sibi, dira quia penitus meant, nec nocentia corpori mentis vulnere saviunt. Which means, this terrible pharmaca is so strong that it cuts to the core of a person's being. The pharmacon enters to the inner essence of the self. Those pharmaca that destroy the body are not nearly as powerful as those that corrupt the mind. But the warnings of Ambrose and Boethius and some others fell on deaf ears. And by medieval times, Christians were interpreting these experiences had when taking these plant medicines in ways that are pretty far out. For example, we have the Trudpeter Hohelied, written around 1160, which places the intoxicating effects of mandrake squarely within the realm of mystical Christian symbolism. The bark of mandrake root brings intoxication. This root denotes God, the image of whom was Christ. On earth he was a man. For us he is a medicine and a security for eternal life. He is the root. The root's bark is the Holy Ghost. This means the numbing vapor that makes all lovers of Holy Christ sleep. It's also important to note that that document was written in vulgar German. That means that the author, whoever she was, wanted these ideas to be as accessible to as many people as possible. And that is a lousy way of trying to cover something up. There were also Renaissance magicians and alchemists like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim and Paracelsus, both of whom were Bible-believing Christians. Agrippa tells us that he used to inhale henbane and opium in order to make the images of spirits forthwith appear in the air or elsewhere. If someone wants to say that opium and henbane are not really psychedelic, Well, the way Agrippa was using them to make spirits appear in the air? That sounds pretty mind-manifesting to me. And Paracelsus loved using cannabis and opium and alcohol, usually at the same time, to expand his mind when he was working out a philosophical problem or an alchemical procedure. So here's two more Christians that did not care one iota about covering up their use of these substances. In fact, Agrippa's treatise, The Three Books of Occult Philosophy, where he writes about these practices, was one of the most widely read magical books of the early 1500s. That's not a cover-up. To be fair, one could point to the early modern flying ointments made out of opium, mandrake, henbane, and belladonna that were used by wise women who were unjustly condemned as witches and say, well, look right there, wasn't the church suppressing that form of entheogenism? And the answer is, well, sort of. Some church authorities were definitely condemning it, but others weren't. Christian authorities knew that some people were using these kinds of psychoactive ointments to enter trance states. However, it wasn't always necessarily the trance state or the substances that were condemned. What was condemned was a specific kind of trance state, one that involved the worship of a fertility goddess. So if you wanted to use these kinds of psychoactive ointments to knock yourself into a mystical Christian state, like the kind that Troy Pater Hohelid would recommend, nobody gave a shit. Church authorities were like, yeah, fuck it, have at it. That wasn't the problem. The trance state wasn't the problem. The problem was the female deity, the goddess. And she was condemned whether people used psychoactives to reach her or not. Different church authorities had different opinions on the matter. So guys like Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, who were the two assholes who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, and jurists like the Frenchman Jean Bodin, well, yeah, they absolutely wanted to cover up that it was the plants, the psychoactive plants in the ointments that were causing these otherworldly experiences. They wanted to say that it was all the workings of the devil. But then you had other guys like Johann Nitter, Francesco Goazzo, and Nicholas Remy who were saying, no, this isn't the work of the devil. Look, they have these psychoactives in the ointments they're using. That's what's causing these trance states. So as far as a cover-up is concerned, there is some truth to that here. In fact, we get a really good idea of how this took place through the writings of the Bishop of Avila, Spain, Alonso Tostado. Tostado started off by saying, yeah, these experiences are caused by psychoactive ointments, only later to say, oh no, I was totally wrong about that, it's actually the work of the devil. So with these early modern flying ointments, we get a bit of a mixed bag. There were absolutely some church authorities that were trying to downplay the role of the psychoactives in the ointments in favor of the devil's powers, but they failed miserably in the face of all the other writers that were like, no, this isn't the devil, these women are just on drugs. Come on, dude, you know that. And I cannot stress here enough that the real issue at hand among all of these theologians was not really about psychoactive ointments. It was all about the worship of a goddess. And if you're interested in the full story of how all that happened, please check out my book, The Witch's Ointment, The Secret History of Psychedelic Magic. So the point of all of these examples is to say that, yeah, there were some ancient and medieval Christians who frowned upon people using these plants for their visionary potential, but there were more than enough Christians saying back at them, yeah, fuck off, I'm going to use these plants for their visionary potential. And most importantly, that throughout Christian Europe, there was never a blanket suppression of these mind-altering plants. Well, my friends, that's all I have for you this time, and like always, I'd love to thank you for stopping by. Please like and share this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, get at me on Instagram, and join the Secret Sanctum Psychedelia group on Facebook, of course, if it all be your will. And one of the things I strive to do with all of my research and my books and my videos is show the nuance of history, show just how complicated things actually were in the past. Until next time, I'm Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, reminding you that you free your mind by using your brain. Peace.